Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. We are so happy to have you here. I'm the kind of person who was much happier last year when we had 6 feet of snow on the ground. This warm weather is a little too much for me, but it's still a beautiful day, and we're really glad that you came here. The Old State House, as you know, does these monthly lunchtime lecture programs, and we have all kinds of different topics. And this topic came about in a really interesting way. You know how sometimes things are just meant to happen? Well, my friend Brenda Miller over at the Hartford History Center at the Hartford Public Library called one day, and she said, we have this great exhibit about Bob Steele, and we have to take it down, but it deserves a longer life. Would you like to show it at the Old State House? And we said, of course, because who was more civically involved than Bob Steele? And our mission is history, but also civics. So it seemed like a perfect fit for us, and it is a perfect fit for us. So we have a wonderful Bob Steele exhibit, which you can take a look at after this program or anytime we're open. It's right across the hall. And then at the same time, one of our colleagues at CTN, Joe Patrice, said, hey, there's a book coming out about Hartford Radio. And then we got a notice about this book that just came out about Hartford Radio. And we thought, well, this is too perfect. We have to put all of this together and do a program about radio to go along with the Bob Steele exhibit. And so today, that's what we're doing. And our moderator today is a man named Scott Gray, who is worked with Bob Steele for 22 years, so I can't think of anyone more appropriate to lead our program today. And I want to tell you a little bit about him. I was very excited to read the information about him because I just went last Thursday to the Connecticut Forum where they did a wonderful program on sports, and Rebecca Lobo was there. And I had never really thought too much about UConn basketball, to tell you the truth. But after hearing her speak, I became very interested. So I was thrilled that we had Mr. Gray here today. As I said, he has worked with Bob Steele on the Bob Steele Show for 22 years. He has worked at TIC for 31 years, and he's been in broadcasting in the Hartford market for 40 years. He started out at WINF in Manchester and then worked at WPOP in Newington. Whenever I hear WPOP, I still have this old feeling of fight, because when I was a kid, we always used to fight who was better, POP or DRC. I was on a DRC side. He has also worked as the voice of UConn football and men's basketball for the Connecticut Radio Network, and has been the play-by-play announcer for college soccer on the New England Sports Network in Boston and Sports Channel in New York. He spent 7 seasons broadcasting UConn women's basketball games on the WTIC UConn Radio Network, and was the play-by-play announcer when the UConn women won their first basketball national championship against Tennessee in 1995. And for him, that was a career highlight, and I can see why. He has been honored 6 times as the Connecticut Sportscaster of the Year by the National Sportscasters and Sports Writers Association, and we are honored to have him and our other guests with us today.
Thank you, Sally. I have been working. I'm really kind of an oddity in the broadcasting business. To say you've worked 40 years in broadcasting and you actually could have done every part of that career, all the different radio stations and the various networks that I've worked for, getting out of the same bed in the same bedroom every morning. I have never lived more than 20 miles from my first radio station, and I look back on it, 40 years in Hartford radio, and I'm thinking to myself, now here we are doing this symposium on the history of Hartford radio, and I think, my God, I am the history of Hartford radio. And certainly there is a story behind every gray hair on my head. I understand that many of you are here for your lunch break, and we're going to move this right along. So enough about me. I do want to thank Sally very much for getting everything I wrote about myself right. But now I would like to introduce one of the catalysts for us being here, the gentleman who wrote the book, Hartford Radio. And for those of you who haven't had a chance to see it, you would find it very fascinating. It's a pictorial history of the medium in this market. And it's fascinating to me in going through the book, and I have gone through it 3 times now, to see how much Hartford history is actually wrapped up in the history of Hartford radio. And the gentleman who wrote the book is a figure, a long-standing figure in Hartford radio, certainly well-known to everybody who has worked in the medium in this market. Currently the general manager of WWUH, which is the University of Hartford radio station. He is now also the chief engineer for WCCC radio. And when he gets up here, maybe he'll tell you the story of the initials WCCC, which I didn't realize until I read the book, even though I grew up in this market. And he has been chief engineer at a number of stations over the years. He's worked at WDRC, WRCH, as I said, WCCC, WHYN, and to say it succinctly, he has literally been around the radio block, and he has written a very fascinating book. And I'd like to ask you all now to please welcome John Ramsey.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you to the Old State House personnel for putting on this event. My only first comment is I'm not worthy to be on the same bill with Bob Steele, who I grew up with. He was a mentor of mine later on in broadcasting, but he was an icon as a listener growing up in Hartford, along with people like Dickie Robinson and Charlie Parker at WDRC. To be involved with them in the tiniest bit of way is just a thrill that I would never thought I would have. The book started out with a website, hartfordradiohistory.com, that still exists. In fact, the book has over 200 photos. The website has over 2,000 photos of Hartford radio history. In fact, the website has been expanded to include almost all of Connecticut. In fact, I think that we have something on there for every Connecticut station. The book was an attempt to document, along with the website, to document the rich history of Hartford radio. I realized as I enter my fourth decade in broadcast engineering in Hartford that a lot of our history is slipping away. People that, like Bob Steele and Charlie Parker, that we looked up to as youngsters growing up and listened to eagerly for school closings and stuff, they're not with us anymore. And along with that, the radio station industry has changed dramatically. In the last 20 or 30 years, things have changed so that stations are really treated as commodities by the owners of the broadcast stations. It used to be the person that owned WDRC really cared about the music, and the person that owned WCCC was Bill Savitt, who liked classical music, and that's one thing that they had on early on. Nowadays, it's a business. They don't necessarily like what they play, and because of that, a lot of the archives and a lot of the history has been lost. In fact, the book wouldn't have been possible without the WTIC and CBS Radio. Their photographs make up over half of the book, which is appropriate because they were such a large station and they had such an influential effect on the industry. But I want to thank the folks at TIC for preserving the history, because we had WTIC with several thousand photos, WDRC with 18, and most stations had 0. So the fact that I was able to get 220 photographs, which was the minimum for the Arcadia Publishing Company, high-quality photos, it's people like Steve Parker that donated photos, individuals, because the stations didn't save the stuff, particularly with all the ownership changes. Let's get on to some neat photos. Some of these photos are in the book, which I will have on sale after the event today, and some of them are unique just to the website here. Of course, Bob Steele, the legendary. This is Hartford's first station. Actually started in New Haven because it was the first station in Connecticut. WPAJ, which later became WDRC, started in 1922/1923 in New Haven. It was owned by Franklin Doolittle, who was an entrepreneur, and he was an experimenter and a radio buff, and he was an appliance salesman. He had an appliance store. And one thing I found out in doing the book, that these appliance salesmen, they wanted to sell these newfangled things called radio. The trouble is there were no radio stations on in Connecticut. So he wanted to sell the radios, didn't have a radio station, so a lot of these guys, like Doolittle, put radio stations on in the back of their stores to be able to sell more radios. He didn't do it just for that reason. He certainly gets credit for a lot more stuff, but like others, he was an entrepreneur and decided without that. At nighttime back in the 20s, you could hear stations from New York sometimes, but there was no local station. So this was one of his first studios in New Haven before they moved it up to Hartford and changed the call letters to WDRC. This is actually the store, the appliance store, and in the middle, it's hard to see, but it says radio station WDRC. He changed the call letters to New Haven, and he was selling radios out of there. So that's a very, very unique photograph, which is great to have. This was WTIC, which signed on the air just a few years later in 1925. I work at the University of Hartford station, and at the University of Hartford campus, I show this picture to some students. They say, wow, they had direct TV back then? Look at those satellite dishes. And those aren't satellite dishes, those are old-fashioned loudspeakers. In one of these photos, this may not be the one, there's actually Morse code keys visible because they were still using Morse code to communicate, which is because telephone was still pretty new in the 20s. Not everybody had telephones. So this was the master control at 26 Grove Street in Hartford, where WTIC was. TIC is one of only 2 stations that I've been able to find in the entire country that were started by an insurance company. It's an interesting, you can see why Travelers had started the weather service, the Travelers Weather Service, because they needed to be able to forecast the weather to predict what their costs would be and their liabilities and how their customers and policyholders would fare. But to have a radio station was unique. There's more about that, and there's actually a picture of the gentleman who convinced Travelers to start the station in the book. This, according to the GIC archives, this is the secretarial staff of WTIC. This is 1926. This is the letters they received in 1 month. Unsolicited. It wasn't a contest. They just said, hey, if you hear us, send in letters. And in the course of being on the air for 80 plus years, WTIC has proof that they've been heard in every country in the world. 50,000 watts, particularly back before there was so much interference, got out very, very well. The towers for WTIC were on top of the studio building at 26 Grove Street. Those towers existed until the 40s when they were donated to the police department. But also in researching the book, I found out that the Travelers Tower, which we're all familiar with in this photograph, when it was built, it was the 7th tallest structure in the world. I verified that from 2 sources. I couldn't believe it, but it was certainly the tallest thing between Boston and New York for many, many decades. DRC moved, as I mentioned, to Hartford, to the Bloomfield area. This is their existing plot of land in Blue Hills Avenue. It had a different number back then, but it's 869 Blue Hills now. The original towers and the original transmitter building that Doolittle built when he moved to Hartford. The move to Hartford was basically based on network. The CBS network didn't have an affiliate up in Hartford, and they wanted to bring CBS up here. He couldn't do that in New Haven, so it was too close to New York City. But that property's still there. They spent a total of $50,000 in 1929 buying the land and building the facility and the towers and the equipment and such. The foundation of one of those towers still stands there. And maybe, as an engineer, I'm fascinated by all things technical, but it's nice to say that that's been preserved. They moved shortly thereafter to 750 Main Street. In fact, they were there twice. They had the penthouse at one point, a studio set up looking like a D with a control room in the middle, because they were a big D, as you know, and neon call letters, which I don't remember seeing up there. But anybody here recall seeing the call letters there? But fascinating story. They moved from Bloomfield to Hartford a couple of times, and they're back in Bloomfield now. It's interesting to think about before recording tape. Recording tape wasn't really popular until after World War II. They played everything off transcription. Wait, no, that's not true. Before that, it was all live. In researching for the book, I found that WTIC in the late 20s had 109 musicians on the payroll. Not sure if they were full-time or part-time, but there was a full-time symphony orchestra, there was a chamber music orchestra, jazz ensemble, and it said that the reason being that the recordings that were out there, the records, were of poor technical quality, and there was a very limited selection. So when you heard music on the radio, up until the late 30s probably, was most likely played live in the studio. And some of the interesting photos of WTIC studios in the 20s and 30s, which were often larger than this room, because they had to support the orchestras, they all had 2 pianos, and several of them had a large harp and what looked like a clavinet. It's a small keyboard instrument. I'm not sure what it is, but all the studios had that. This gentleman was Eddie O'Shea, who went on to Hollywood. He was a sound effects guy. And he had 3 or 4 turntables there, some of them with 2 tone arms, talk about confusing, and he'd play sound effects because there was no tape recording back then. I love this photo. In fact, the book has 2 photos, both from the 1936 flood, which was a traumatic event for the city of Hartford and most of Connecticut. This is the WTIC announcers covering the flood by candlelight, flashlight, and oil lamp. And I found an identical photo in the archives from DRC of them covering the flood by flashlight and candlelight. It's amazing. You know, before television, before the internet, radio was all there was for immediate news. You know, the newspapers were great. You'd hear today's news tomorrow. But if you wanted to hear what was going on now, his radio was the king. We really can't quite imagine that. Another great photograph, and it's got a typo in the book. I've got the wrong date in the book, unfortunately. But this is the correct date. The same flood. This is looking from the top of the Travelers Tower, and it's looking towards southwest. Brainerd Field is a large clearing in the upper right. There's the power plant sticking out into the river there. You can see how extensive the flooding was. The Park River is right in the middle there. Radio played a key role because a lot of people had lost power, and back then many of the radios were battery operated as they are now. Bob Steele again, legendary, commissioning or groundbreaking Constitution Plaza in the early 60s, and with a picture of Broadcast Plaza, which was just torn down 2 years ago, where WTIC radio was for decades and Channel 3 was until they moved to Rocky Hill. The antenna switch, Bob Steele often talked about the antenna switch. And the funny thing is, it actually makes history because no other announcer, no other radio station has been successful in selling something that can't be sold, which is time when you're off the air. For many, many decades, Bob Steele's show, he had the antenna switch when the station shut down momentarily for a few seconds and switched from one antenna pattern to another. That was required by the FCC. I won't get into the technology behind it, but it was required by law. So he had a sponsor every day. So they paid money for when the station was off the air. That's amazing. And this is what the antenna switch looks like. So those of you that maybe grew up listening to that, you now know what the antenna switch looks like. That's up on Avon Mountain with their towers. Now, I remember watching TV in the 60s when I was a teen and seeing Bill Savitt, who was another entrepreneur and a media maven, standing on his head doing, I think, live TV commercials. Maybe they were taped. Well, this picture is 10 years earlier. I think Savitt got the idea from Bob Steele of standing on his head for a promotional stunt. I'm not sure. I love that old microphone, too. They don't make them like that anymore. Also historic in Hartford was FM radio, and I think we're going to talk about that in a little while. Hartford was the scene, actually Meriden, but the Hartford area in general was the scene of one of the country's first FM stations. It was called W1XPW because FM was considered experimental by the government back then. In 1939, Franklin Doolittle, again, a visionary, decided he wanted to build an FM station, and he worked with Major Edwin Armstrong, who was the founder and the inventor of FM. He actually discovered the technology that makes FM work and just about every radio you've ever seen work. Armstrong invented it as static-free radio because AM was plagued with noise from lightning storms, from other things. So he invented static-free radio, and Doolittle worked with him and started in 1939 as an experimental FM station, which today is still operating. It is the ownership of it. It's controversial, but the ownership of the license has changed hands over the years, and it's now WHCN. A lot of people say it's WDRC-FM. We could discuss that at length, but I think the ownership, what is the history of a radio station? It's the license itself. This license, W1XPW, an FM station in 1939, the state's first, one of the first in the country, is now WHCN. So we could talk about that. The interesting thing about this is they have preserved, Clear Channel owns the station now, WHCN, and if you look here, that's what it looks like as of a year or two ago. I've swapped back and forth, the same building. I did this photograph by memory. No, I wasn't there in 39. I didn't take that picture. Some of the students say that I work with. Were you there in 1939? This picture I took from memory to try and match up, but it's kind of neat to see that the original pole, that's the silver thing in front of you that the antenna was on. And Armstrong was involved with this both for static-free radio, and also he wanted to have a radio network. Now, radio networks go back to the 20s, but radio network that was connected without wires. And this is when wireless was, they called radio wireless back then. So he used Meriden, which was the highest spot in that part of the state, to link up Paterson, New Jersey with New York City, Alpine, New Jersey with New York City, Meriden to Boston to Mount Washington. He wanted to cover most of New England with a network connecting them all via radio using his new FM technology. AM was too noisy to do that. So the network technology and the FM technology was very historic, and Connecticut plays a role in that. And WHCN would be, or DRC, would be listed as the first commercial station that was FM in the country. They got their first FM commercial license that wasn't experimental. Promotional vehicles. I work on the engineering side of broadcasting, so I'm often involved with the promotional vehicles. Stations have NLC FM down New London has the yellow submarine, which is a truck made out to look like a submarine because they're down in Groton, New London. The top left photo here is the first promotional vehicle, which was actually an engineering vehicle used by WTIC. They used that truck, and those three engineers did the first broadcast on the first day of WTIC coming on the air in 1925. Everything, and there's actually another photograph I have in the book of the inside of that truck, lined with equipment. Right now, DIC could broadcast from here with better quality with something that you hold in the palm of your hand. So the technology has changed a lot. Lower left is another great, I'm not a car buff, but somebody could tell me the exact year of that car. Anybody here recognize that? But it's a neat, probably 40s, I assume. DIC covering a political event. Top right is Dickie Robinson at WDRC's. DRC called itself the station with the beach reach. And so they got the dune buggy to make a big splash down on the beach. And on the bottom right, a Hummer H1 for the Rock WCCC. Got a lot of attention on the streets more contemporarily. Can't have a history lesson here and talk about history without Brad Davis, who was instrumental in broadcasting. He says that Bob Steele was one of his main mentors. Brad's been on the radio for over 4 decades here, currently on DRC most of the time, although I believe he started at WTIC. A lot of people remember his pushing milk as part of the different TV things that he did. Another great DRC picture. This would have been the cover for the book, and I'd never written a book before, and luckily I had some good legal advice. This was going to be the cover. Dickie Robinson said, that was taken with my camera. You can use the photo. You have to get the rights of the person who owns the rights to the photo. You have to get that signed off on to put it on a book. In a book. Well, luckily I checked with the legal counsel. You can't use VIPs or celebrities' photos to sell a book without paying them, or at least getting their permission. So these other folks, I don't need to get somebody's permission to put their picture in the book. I need to get the rights of the person who owns the photograph. But if you're using somebody who's famous, you need to get their permission too, because otherwise you're making money off their image. So this picture did not make it into the book, but it's a great photo of the Rolling Stones. I should have mentioned that earlier. That's Mick Jagger opposite Dickie Robinson in the DRC conference room. Kind of a neat photo. Another great promotional vehicle. Unique, maybe they have these in Denver, but around here, it's in Bushnell Park. I recognize the background there. Fun is WDRC, and it's their ski daddler. And that little lunchbox thing there is not his lunchbox, but that's a two-way radio. You use a cell phone for that now, but he'd able to do live broadcasts, talk about distractive driving. Live broadcasts from the ski daddler. Promotion was king in radio. You know, it wasn't just what you heard on the air. With a rivalry between WPOP and DRC particularly, they hired the best talents. They had the newest music first. They tried to, and they had the best signal. But they also tried to do things off-air, like the ski daddler and the snowmobile. But the colored vinyl the DRC, that POP came out with in the early 70s, and I think late 60s actually, was pretty neat. They had promotional albums with compilations of different songs on there. These are the boss jocks from WPOP, some of them from 1967. A lot of you grew up listening to the POP, and the rivalry was a legend between the two stations. Few other markets had anything like that before or after. Now, we talked about the information age. This is the newsroom at WTIC circa 1971. You know, 4 or 5 or 6 teletype machines. You know, students can't imagine a teletype machine, a big, ugly machine making lots and lots of noise, spewing out reams of paper. You know, the phone that I have on my hip will get me much more information much quicker than I could ever get in that newsroom, and yet that was a state-of-the-art newsroom. Amazing to think how technology's changed. We have all this information available to us now. And radio is less important as a news source, certainly for many of us, but I think radio still has a role, and I think we'll talk more about that today, too. I mentioned Bill Savitt. Well, he and his brother Max, who was a judge, founded WCCC in 1947. The call letters standing for, a lot of people think it stands for the fact that he was in the jewelry business, the 3 C's of diamonds, but according to the original documentation, it was "We Cover Connecticut's Capital," WCCC. One of the interesting stories about WCCC was told by a gentleman who did a morning show there back in the 50s. He said it was mid-50s. CCC was a 500-watt daytime-only station up against TIC's 50,000 watts and DRC's 5,000. And he said, but they were making a go at it. They had some listeners, and they were doing okay with advertising. He said one morning he woke up in East Hartford at 4 a.m., and there was 2 feet of snow on the ground. Weather forecasting wasn't as good. And so he called Bill Savitt and said, Bill, you got to get one of the guys that lives in town, because I can't, there's no way I'm going to come into the driveways. Stay where you are, Bill Savitt said. 15 minutes later, he heard diesel engines and people shoveling, and the National Guard had come out to dig him out and took him into the station and dropped him off at the Bond Hotel where the studios were, and he was able to get on the air for a 6 o'clock show. And he thought to himself later on in the day, he said, boy, I must be pretty important to be able to get that kind of service. People must listen. And the secretary said, no. Mr. Savitt called his friend, the governor, and got the National Guard out there. It's not you. It's Savitt. But Bill Savitt, of course, POM Jewelry Store. He had the station more than just as a promotional vehicle. And what amazed everybody in the market was that he bought as much time on all the competing stations as he did on his own, as he got for free on his own station. He really wanted to promote that jewelry store and the other things that he did. So this is them celebrating the kickoff of the FM station. You can see on the sign there in the upper right, 106.9 for the FM. This was Joe Durand, who worked at a number of stations, including WCCC and WDRC, and I think WTIC, a promotional photo, flipping the records, of course. WTHT is an interesting story. Does anybody here remember WTHT? What did it stand for? Hartford Times. The Hartford Courant had a station for about 2 years back in the 20s that didn't go anywhere, and nobody can really tell us why. We've been doing a lot of research. But the Hartford Times got into radio big time, first with an AM station, and then in the early 50s with an FM station, and it gave everybody a run for the money. They had the resources of the Hartford Times newspaper, which was the afternoon newspaper here in Hartford, but they finally went off the air in '54 when they merged with some other stations, and it became WPOP was one of the stations, and also the 1230 station in Manchester. So they went away in name only, and the people kind of divided up. One interesting story about WTHT FM, which was the transmitter was on top of the Hubline Tower. With FM, the higher the antenna, the better. And if you've been up there for leaf peeping, you certainly know how high that location is. So the engineer, the studios were in Hartford, but the engineer was on top of the building there. They left the windows open by mistake on a winter evening when they signed off at 1 o'clock in the morning. Much to their dismay, they came in the morning. There had been a blizzard, and the whole transmitter room was filled with snow. All the equipment was destroyed. The station was off the air. The general manager, whether he or she fired anybody, I don't know, but he said, "Let's get some new equipment. Let's get the station on the air." 7 days later, they'd received no phone calls, no letters about what happened to WTHT FM, so he canceled the order and the station went away. I mentioned WCCC being in the Hotel Bond. They were in the basement of the Hotel Bond. There's a picture of the marquee there with the call letters on it. And of course, Bill Sabat being the promotional man that he was, it wasn't in the basement, it was in the lower street level of the Hotel Bond. They had the ballroom upstairs, and the Hotel Bond was a very ritzy hotel, one of the fanciest ones between Boston and Hartford. So when these musicians and different musical groups and singers would come through, they'd often lay over in Hartford and do a gig upstairs at the Bond Hotel. The trouble was CCC couldn't broadcast it because they were a daytime-only station. So sometimes it would be DRC or TIC that broadcast the event, but they often had the artists come downstairs to the lower street level to do interviews while they were on the air. And that's my presentation. Thank you. I'll have a chance to answer questions. Sean, yes.
Did they ever do a breakfast club from one of the stores in downtown Hartford like they did at Bridgeport?
Which station? I know WHCN did in the 70s. They'd actually go to people's houses. You'd win a contest. You get to have the morning crew broadcast from your house in the morning. But other than that, it sounds familiar, but I don't know for sure whether that happened. Steve.
Maybe once a month or so, maybe the television, better.
Yeah, for DRC. Yes.
On the first stereo program in Connecticut, that DRC in the late 40s when Mr. Armstrong and engineer Harry Broderick, they put the AM station on one side of the room, if you will, at home, and he taught me to put the FM station 8 feet apart on the other side of the room. And they broadcasted the stereo component FM to AM. And that was essentially the first type of stereo in Connecticut.
Yes,
I was there to hear it. So
DRC did that early on, and I know TIC in the late 50s, early 60s did a lot of that. In fact, if you ever find a radio at a tag sale with a separate AM/FM dial,
yes,
totally separate, like two radios in one, that's a collector's item that could get you a lot of money or be worth having.
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now we'll move on to the panel part of our program, and I will say that Brad Davis did broadcast from State House Square in the mornings, because I remember being on that show when I worked at the Noah Webster House, so that was like in the 80s or 90s, I think he did that. Anyway, back to Scott Gray.
Okay, and I believe we will have an opportunity for questions and answers at the end of this segment. At this point, I'd like to introduce our other two panel members, and of course, you've already met John. Chris Watts, on John's left, is an award-winning newscaster, or I should say is assistant director at the Vintage Radio and Communications Museum in Windsor. After years in local radio, he's traveled around into a number of other markets. He worked at AP in Washington. He's been a news reporter, worked for Associated Press locally. He was a national editor for AP's Radio Wire service, the editor for the Associated Press 24-hour news radio service, later moved to Metro Networks in Hartford, and he served as bureau chief. That is now part of Westwood One. And, well, there's the cover of the book. And I just brought it up accidentally. I have no idea how. I am a technological idiot, so it was an accident, I assure you. Now, the next panelist I'm going to introduce personally. I'm not going to read the bio here because this lovely lady and I, literally, for the last quarter of a century, have worked 5 feet apart every morning at WTIC. She's an award-winning journalist. She is one of the most competent news people that I have ever had the pleasure of working with in this business. She started her career in Providence, Rhode Island, which I'm going to ask her about in a moment, and then came to WTIC. I believe next month she will be celebrating her 26th anniversary. 27th anniversary at WTIC. We worked together on the afternoons at WTIC, and for the better part of the last quarter century have worked together on the morning shows on WTIC. We may be the last 2 remaining full-time members of the Bob Steele Show at WTIC, Angela Dias. And Angela, I'm going to start with you because John and I were talking about this before we started the program today. And we've seen a lot of the changes that radio has gone through, certainly FM, AM radio, FM radio, the various equipment changes, and certainly the personnel changes. But one of the things that we really can't put our finger on is in the early days of radio, you see all of these men who basically started the business and ran the business. There were a number of women involved, but their role was primarily women's shows.
That's right.
That were pretty much dictated by men. Mm-hmm. And we were trying to think who the first female newscaster might have been in the market. I can think back to the mid to late 70s, Adrienne Bonds, Marlene Schneider at Channel 3, and I'm thinking that it's quite possible our own Dana Whalen may have pioneered that.
Probably, yeah.
But what I'm curious about, Angela, during that era, you started your career in Providence. What was it like breaking into news as a woman at that time?
Well, it was the 70s, a time when women were breaking into a lot of male-dominated fields, and radio was one of them. And you'll notice that in a lot of these pictures, there's usually 1 or 2 women on the air staff, as Scott mentioned, mainly who broadcast about women's issues. The 70s changed that, but there was some resistance. I remember a general manager saying to me, "Oh, you'll be okay because people like listening to your voice." There was this attitude that women's voices would turn listeners off, and audiences were used to the baritone voices of the men on the radio, and that's what people were used to, and women on the air there was a little bit of resistance. Of course, that's broken down. And I think even now, men in radio don't necessarily have to have the golden tones that Scott has, but that quality isn't necessarily as important. But there was a little bit of resistance, but we overcame.
As we move the history of radio along, I'm going to go to Chris now, because let's go right back to the very beginning. And Chris, in your research for the Connecticut Radio Museum, what are some of the equipment? What's some of the equipment that you find that you look at this and say it's absolutely amazing that we were actually able to make this work at one time?
Well, the thing that always, when we give tours, we talk about the early days of radio being very tenuous. There was no real power at people's homes to work the units, so everything was, up until 1927, there were no radios that plugged into the wall. So everything worked off of these big car-type batteries that would leak acid all over the floors. One of the things we love to show at the museum is there's a wall of early radios, home radios. And it was really for geeks of the 19-teens and 1920s, because you would have one box with 10 dials on it, and you had to know how to tweak all those dials in order to possibly get a radio station. And in the 1920s, there was a major effort by manufacturers to try to simplify radio. And so by 1927, RCA came out with the Radiola 17, which was the first plug-in radio, and it had what they called a rectifier tube inside it that allowed electricity from the wall to generate direct current, which you needed to work the radio. And it had one knob to turn the volume up and one knob to tune the radio stations. Now it was easy, and then everybody started to buy them. And it always amazes me that it was so complex on the end users, and that radio, it was, I mean, it's like television. I mean, with the early TVs were this big, and people would sit around at home and watch the fight and try to make out what it is. And nowadays, television's a huge power. So it's the same thing with radio. You always say, wow, these early adopters, they must have really wanted it bad. And I can't imagine what it was like back on the engineering side to try to keep these things going, because, tubes would be blowing and overloading, and you'd be constantly changing this, and then I mean, it was all experimental and cloth wire insulation, and I mean it was not the safest thing in the world. So it always amazes me that it was able to catch on as it did.
Okay, now we don't have a lot of time, and we do want to move forward to the present and the future of radio, but I do want to ask, well, first Chris and Angela, in your time, Angela, in the business, what is the biggest advancement in radio? What do you think was the biggest development to change the face of the business since you've been in it?
Scott, in some ways, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Sure, the technology has changed incredibly. Whereas in the early days, radio was in the forefront of technology, and some people may have written off radio as being, old school technology, but what's happened, in my view, is that we have adapted to the new technology because the intent is still the same. It's always to communicate. So the biggest change technologically is the same change that all media companies have to deal with, and that is the internet. But you know what? You can listen to us on the internet, WTIC.com. So we are part of the change in technology. And I was also struck by that picture from the 1936 flood, where the WTIC staff is broadcasting by candlelight. Well, guess what? During the October nor'easter and Tropical Storm Irene, WTIC was broadcasting, and we in the newsroom were using flashlights. We had backup generators that kept us on the air, but the internal power, we don't own the building. So anything that the building owned, like overhead lights or whatever, that was all out. So we used flashlights to read our copy, to look at our computer screens, to make our way to the restrooms, because the building was in total blackness. So again, things have changed as far as technology is concerned, but our mission is still the same, to communicate, as it is with all technology. So we're right there in the forefront these days.
We're going to get to the present day in radio, which you just heard a little bit about. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Before we do, John, I just want to touch on one more facet of the history of radio. Now, having grown up, of course, listening in this market, listening to the WPOP and WDRC music wars, rock and roll wars of the 1960s, to me, I never even thought of the concept of FM radio until around 1967. And then I read your book and find out that FM radio almost dates back to the very inception of radio itself in Connecticut, but it primarily existed until the late 60s as an experimental form of radio, correct?
Yes, FM radio, as I showed in the presentation, it started in 1939 in Connecticut. But what happened was shortly thereafter, the United States went into World War II, and all technology was frozen for domestic consumption, if you will, and was going over to the war effort. World War II ended, and there was certainly a boom in consumerism, but that coincided. FM was there, but also television was beginning to get its foothold, certainly by the early 50s in American households. So the broadcasters weren't sure what to do with FM. They liked the technology. It was easier to tune in. It was clearer in some ways, or in many, many ways. But they mostly just simulcast the programming that they had on their AM station, and AM was still really popular. And it's the same dilemma that we had in the industry with UHF television back years ago, with DTV just a few years ago, to convince the consumer that this is something that's better than you need to go out and buy another radio for. In fact, there's a technology called HD radio that's kind of come and almost gone. Most of you probably haven't even heard of it yet. Same thing. You'd have to buy a new radio to take advantage of this. But FM came into its own mostly because of the music revolution in the 60s. Stations like DRC and VOP didn't have an FM station to roll with them, but the music got the young people listening to the FM radio, and that's why it became so successful.
Chris, I've been remiss. I wanted to ask you where your museum is located.
Oh, we're in Windsor. We're right up the road in Windsor, off exit 37. We're a volunteer organization. We probably have, at least 2,000, 3,000 radios, televisions, and communications equipment, all donated, and we try to preserve and educate people on the history of communications, electronic communications. And the FM story is I mean, we don't have enough time to talk about it, but it's a brilliant story. If anybody ever wants to read the book Empires of the Air, and they can read about the development of FM and the crazy politics that were involved, and it's a brilliant story. And it definitely was a case where you can sometimes find early radios that have 2 FM bands on them. You'll find FM 45 and FM 100, and there's a whole story behind that too.
Well, I'm a little bit older than you, and a little bit older than Angela, and I can remember back in the 50s in Hartford radio, I can remember listening to the Lone Ranger and Roy Rogers on Sunday night on the radio, and I think the last actual radio show that I remember, and I believe it was on WDRC, was they used to run Gunsmoke in the afternoon. I think that was back around 1960, and that was the end of it. Radio was forced into a transition, was it not? Television forced radio to turn over the entertainment media to television, and radio had to transition itself. How much of that transition is what we know today? I mean, did radio immediately say, we're going to become an information media? What was the transition like?
Well, I think one of the things that helped was the advent of tape. Tape was actually invented by the Germans, and it came to the United States after World War II. And I'm trying to remember. I think it was Bing Crosby was the gentleman that had Ampex, and they kind of reverse engineered and got synthetic backings, and they perfected tape. Originally, it was on paper and it would break. And by the time television started coming on, the first TVs actually were ready to go before World War II. The first TV was unveiled in '39. It just, the war came along and stopped everything. So as television started to catch on and you started to lose these dramas, and how do we fill in? What are we going to do? And they would do entertainment shows, they would do music. And, they talked a little bit about the transcription discs. I mean, records were a pain because they scratched and they could only be played so many times, but they wore down. So the advent of tape allowed them to send recordings around the country, and then you also had microwave technology that would allow radio stations to share. They actually use shortwave and also regular broadcast to share nationwide broadcasts. And by doing that, they started saying, okay, how can we fill this time? We have to do something that's going to appeal to people. We can't do these dramas anymore because they've moved over to TV. But one of the challenges that they faced was that there was this push to move to be kind of the national stuff. You started getting the mutual broadcasting and CBS, and they're running the things that you can go anywhere in the country and hear the same show. But they still tried to latch on to that local stuff. And the modern radio, since deregulation in the 1990s, the challenge has been how much of that local content is important. And you see a lot of radio ownership stations I hate to knock on Clear Channel, but Clear Channel, has invented this I Love Radio internet app. And if you actually can, in a couple places in Connecticut, you can hear 2 of their radio stations playing the same thing because on the weekends they're simulcasting their internet broadcast. So they've lost that local connection because, as we said, it's a commodity. In newspaper, there's been a huge move in the last 5 years to become hyper-local. You've seen a lot more local newspapers come up because they're trying to, that's keeping them in business. The question is going to be, how much of that can they do in radio and be financially sound? I mean, TIC, it does at least have local shows. DRC has some, but they just asked Dan Lavallo this past week. Again, it's too much money. So it's a balancing act.
John, I'm going to say 2 words to you. We were talking earlier about the advancements in radio and, of course, all the research you did, and we go back to these huge vacuum tubes that originally went into putting a signal out. So I'm going to say 2 words to you, and you kind of tell me what it's meant to the business. Computer chip.
Well, computers have certainly changed the way the equipment that radio stations work. But I'm proud to say that the listener no longer are stations playing LPs or tapes. All of you can hear a lot of programs stations that start getting, I will say that stations really not going to almost at midnight after a game, and I hear the weather forecast. Well, coming up later this afternoon, they record the weather forecast at 3 o'clock in the afternoon before the person goes off duty, and they play it all night long. But a lot of that stuff that you hear on the air is pre-recorded, so it's very handy to have, for the broadcaster, to have these things. Very handy to have these things stored digitally. If they don't use it properly, then I think the listeners suffer. But overall, the technology, the computer chip has helped broadcasting immensely.
And in keeping with the way radio has changed and the way it's perceived within the community, we went from that entertainment medium to music. Radio really dominated the 60s. Then as FM came in, AM's role in the market changed. And I've got to say, we at WTIC have been somewhat of an anomaly in the country in that we're probably the only AM station that through that entire transition has managed to maintain its #1 position in the market through the whole thing. But again, the role continues to change. Angela, as a news person working in the business today, there was a time when news people worked not so much with the disc jockeys, but it was to the teenager who primarily was that audience. It was an unwelcome break in the music, time for the news. Now there seems to be more of a relationship between the air personality and the news people as it's become more of an information resource. How do you view your role in the business today?
Well, we are at an information age, and that's why I say that we at WTIC are in the forefront because we dispense information. That's my role. My role is to dispense information. The whole station's role is geared toward information so that whenever there's something like a huge snowstorm, when there's an election, when there's a disaster, when there's a local sports team that's playing somewhere, and we have many. We're there providing you the information about what's going on big issues like politics, like a disaster that would affect everyone, and the smaller elements, the smaller everyday elements of life. We're woven into the fabric of people's lives. A part of that now is because of technology. We are able to expand our reach, I think, because of technology. So that's my role, and that's the station's role, to present people with information. And we are in an information age.
I think really with the technology that exists today, we have the technological ability to switch almost immediately. We can go from the studio to the scene.
Oh,
almost
absolutely.
Immediately.
And even something like of course, we pride ourselves on being live. I mean, you're listening to something live. On TV, there isn't a lot live. There's some things that are live, not very much. We are live. But yet the beauty of technology allows someone like Scott to write his commentary and air it live at 8:15. But if for some reason you've missed it or you want to hear it again, it's also on the net. So again, it's a perfect melding of technology and the information age. And radio, I think, is very often overlooked as part of that technological revolution, but it really shouldn't be, in my opinion.
You know, there has been remote broadcasting for quite some time,
Yeah.
but it primarily was a planned event. Now you can do it instantaneously. There's something going on somewhere. You can get somebody there, and you can get it on the air almost instantaneously.
That's true.
And talking about that, talking about where we are with the state of the art today in the broadcast or radio medium, it's so hard for me to see how far we've come since I started in the business. I started with reel-to-reel tapes, going to cassette tapes, and then going to mini discs, and then to the computer disc, digital recording devices that you can hold in your hand and actually do editing with and everything else. And when I see the massive development in technology over the last 40 years, it's hard for me to believe there's anywhere else to go. So I'm going to put it to the three of you. What do you see as the future of this medium? Anybody want to start?
When I worked at the Associated Press, we used to fight amongst ourselves at the AP because AP had, it's a newspaper organization, but they begrudgingly have broadcast parts too. So you have the newspaper, you have the radio, and you had the television. And they used to all think that the other one stunk and that they were the best one. And I used to say, you know, being a moderator, I guess I would say that, well, you know, I think all three have their purpose. You know, a radio lets you know what's going on right now. If there was an emergency, you'd flip your radio on, you know, because the TV stations may not get there right away. So you want, you know, if you want to know what's the information. You want to see what it looks like, you turn on the television. Like 9/11, you wanted to see what it looked like when the planes hit the tower, you watched it on TV, you didn't listen. But when it first happened, you probably were listening to the radio. If you want to know the person's middle name, you read the newspaper story the next day. You know, and I say that as a joke, but newspaper affords you much more detail, much more content that you would never, ever have on radio or television. So all three mediums have their purpose. The question moving forward is, you know, the Internet, how does that affect it? You know, what's that going to be down the road? You know, and how can they manage the profitability? That's the big challenge, because all these media outlets, whether you like it or not, are businesses. And the Internet has made it challenging because how many of us go at home and we flip on, you know, we go read the news. You know, I don't subscribe to the Hartford Courant any longer, right? I read it online. I get almost everything. I don't pay for it. Well, the Courant's not very happy about that. So the thing is, how do you work that monetary part of it? That's going to be, I think, the biggest challenge going forward for any media organizations. How do you keep giving the content to pay to gather this and have people pay, because nobody wants to pay for anything anymore. So that's a tough challenge, I think, personally.
Well, you know, Angela, with the Internet the way it is, do you envision radio, maybe the next step, becoming a video medium, a visual medium?
I mean, it's possible. There have been some experiments with that, you know, simulcasting live on the Internet. But one thing that we're not talking about, that we haven't talked about yet when it comes to radio and the future, is the human element, the human connection. Yeah, you can get your news on the Internet. You can get our news on the Internet, really. But you're lacking the human connection. People know Ray Dunaway. They knew Bob Steele. They knew Arnold Dean. They know Scott Gray. These are personalities who brought their worldviews, their ordinary lives to their on-air work in some capacity, small, large. For me, it's smaller. For someone like Bob Steele, it was larger. But that human connection is what's going to keep us going in the future. Even young people today, this is my prediction, young people today, and I have a college-age kid and a teenage boy, they're all into their devices, right? There's very little communication. Nobody calls each other on the phone anymore among the younger generation. But there's going to come a point, the way I see it, when they are going to be starved for that human connection in technology. And where do you find that? On the radio. That's what's going to propel us forward, the human connection.
And to be a little self-serving, you don't find that anywhere in radio, done better anywhere in radio than on WTIC. And I will add Angela Dias to that list of, to that list of human connection that is so important. And, you know, we talk about what we can do. And during the last fall and some of the disasters that we went through, I think we really demonstrated, a lot of radio stations demonstrate what we can do, or what they can do. But at WTIC, we demonstrated what radio really can do when given the chance.
Yeah, during those disasters, so many people came up to so many people at our station. Thank goodness you were on the air. We would never been able to find out what was going on because, gee, they didn't have electricity and they couldn't get their news on the internet for days on end. But because of, you know, obviously car radios, battery-operated radios, we reached many, many people who depended on us. And that's what's going to keep radio going.
And that's because you give people what they want. And Angela mentioned UConn sports. Believe me, people in this state want UConn sports. So you're there, you give them what you want, but you're also ready to shift to what they need at a moment's notice. And I think that, to me, is the beautiful thing about radio. Now, let's go to the guy who researched this back almost 100 years ago. And, you know, John, we've been talking about you as the author of this book, but let's get back to the fact that you are the general manager of the University of Hartford's radio station. You are the chief engineer of a commercial radio station. What do you see in the next decade?
Well, I think the example that Andrea gave, and I certainly agree with what Chris said as well, that radio, the personality of radio and the immediacy, you know, with the snowstorm that we all went through just 3 or 4 months ago, the TV stations, even if they were on the air, and most of them were on the air, your TVs didn't work at home, your cable didn't work, your batteries went down on your smartphone, or your cable was down. It's so important. Congress actually said to the Broadcast Association 5 years ago after Katrina that Katrina was the best thing that ever happened to radio, because Congress regulates through Congress, and the FCC, radio is regulated by the federal government, and the Congress doesn't really use radio very much in general. Radio is just a kind of an old-style technology. But you had 3 million people plus evacuating the shoreline there of the Gulf of Mexico in advance of Katrina. They didn't have TVs in their cars. If they had portable phones, smartphones back then, the batteries went down after 6 or 10 or 12 hours, but every single one of those cars had an AM radio in it. So AM radio in general is going to be really important going forward into the future, because if those stations that stay current with the technology and stay current with keeping the personality of radio alive, so many of the large groups just do a syndicated program. You hear the exact same program here in Hartford that you do in Memphis and Phoenix and Los Angeles. That's not good radio in my mind. TIC has been one of the stations that's done local radio and really believes in it. And as long as they keep the information content going too, that's the important part.
I did promise that we would have a chance. We will have a chance for people to ask questions, short Q&A. I just want to say before we do, John, this book was fascinating, absolutely. And if I may make a suggestion, I think you should write a sequel. And with all of your connections in the business, people that have been in, that you know that have been in the business so long, you should get a sequel and write some of the stories behind a lot of those pictures. And I think it would be a fabulous piece of reading.
Thank you.
It's a great book, and I suggest that anybody who's here and is interested in this topic stop and see John and get a copy of the book and get it autographed before you leave. Now, we're going to take a few moments for questions, if anybody has one. Okay, you had your hand up back.
I think if you're talking about the future of radio, you should say something about nonprofit radio stations like public radio, WNPR, which has an excellent mixture of local programming and national programming, WMNR, which is an excellent classical music station that is programmed by volunteers, and WWUH. They seem to me to be part of the future of radio.
That's a good point. I'm glad you brought it up. You're right.
I'm just curious how much the future of public radio, for instance, is going to depend on the political climate. If they have to.
But they still do programming where they travel around, like the program Where We Live, which is on weekdays at 9 o'clock. They travel around to various town halls and do programs and get feedback from people who are in the business organizations and so forth. And, you know, there are national programs like Says You, which I think broadcast from the West Hartford Town Hall in connection with the Noah Webster House a short while ago. So they sort of do programming in sort of a traditional way in many ways, you know.
And of course, there's, as we move along, I want to get some more questions, but of course there's also Colin McEnroe, who learned how to do good radio at WTIC.
And Faith Middleton and John Dankowski and the whole group.
Up in the front row here.
My question or comment is similar to the young man that just gave the comment back there, but I'm fortunate enough to have known John Ramsey for about 40 years. I was on the radio at WWUH for a long time. And one thing about University of Hartford or college radio is when I was on, I'm not talking about me, but I had a show that was a 1950s show. The show preceding mine was a bluegrass. We had a Caribbean show. We had an Italian show that followed. It's the diversity of music and type of programming that you don't find in any other type of radio. And John shouldn't belittle himself. I know his dedication goes way beyond money. It has nothing to do with it. It is his dedication to a lifelong endeavor of music and the media and the radio and everything. John is really a great man.
If anybody would like to direct a question directly to any one of the panelists, feel free to do so. Front row.
I just want to say thank you to John because I do know there's more than 18 pictures from WDRC. So I'd love to be able to see a sequel to this book. But one thing I want to point out is John really pushed hard. He went after all of us. He kept asking again and again and again for more information, more material. Who do you know? So the amount of time and work that went into this, and also his website, is absolutely amazing. And I want to thank you for the kind words about my dad, Charlie Parker, too. It really just says a lot about the content of that book. I can't wait to pick it up because it's just so great to see this little teaser here, and the fact that you've made yourself available with your busy schedule to go out and really talk up this book. And TIC, great job. I mean, great job during the storm coverage. That's where we all remembered what transistor radios were all about. Really, really did a great job because that's what it is about communication. And just one last thing, and I'll pass this on. The Connecticut Radio Information System, which has been over here in Windsor for quite a long time. A lot of the commercial radio broadcasters volunteer their time there, and regular folks do too. And it's for people that are blind or reading impaired. So if you need anything like that, the Connecticut Radio Information System is available. I think it's online too, so good stuff. Thank you.
Any other questions? Second row.
To solve a mystery for me, I started listening to UConn basketball sometime in the middle 50s, but I can't remember if it was WTIC and when it was.
WHAY, George Ehrlich, who then moved to WTIC when UConn basketball moved to WTIC.
When did the broadcast of the game start?
I believe they started at WTIC in 1958. Up until then, they were on WHAY, and George Ehrlich was the voice of UConn basketball. At the time that WTIC and Channel 3 were a combo, he was probably the most powerful sports media figure in all of New England. He was the sports director for both WTIC Radio and Channel 3. And he was the voice of UConn football and basketball. So, and he started at WHAY in New Britain, which is now WRCH, correct? Yes. Yes.
The worst day of my life was when I moved to Illinois, and I couldn't get UConn before computers. And I couldn't get UConn basketball.
I amazed you with my instant knowledge of that fact, didn't I? Because for the first 5 years of my career as a sportscaster, when WTIC and Channel 3 split, a lot of the major personalities of that era were left out of work because the business was started growing younger. And a number of those personalities, Gene Colbert, Bob Ellsworth, Art Johnson, emigrated from WTIC to WINF, which was the radio station where I started. And another of the personalities who moved over at the time was George Ehrlich. And my first 5 years as a sportscaster was as his assistant sports director at INF and his color man for Manchester and East Catholic High School basketball. That's why I had all that information right at my fingertips. I thank you, just like I cued you, to ask for asking the question. Any other questions? Okay, I am getting the signal of time. One more question.
Can I just make a comment?
Yeah.
A couple of interesting points is that radio actually began on the phone lines as theatrophone, where they had music, news, and weather in hotel rooms before even Marconi was on the air. So what goes around comes around. And my son, who is an internet entrepreneur, basically said it this way. He said there are 8 conduits to content, and radio is only one of those conduits. So that's the issue. It's the content that people are going to be looking for, and how do you make it convenient, user-friendly, and talk back. Somebody did hint at having pictures. Yes, you're going to have some kind of a graphic with the announcement for the new generation. And RDS, radio didn't embrace that until the internet forced them to. So radio has to stay up with that concept and try to be one of the better conduits to content.
But I do believe that Bob Steele preceded Marconi as well. Okay, I just want to mention a couple of things to you. John will be available. He's got copies of his book. If you'd like to purchase one, you'll find it fascinating. He'll be happy to autograph it for you. I want to thank our panelist, John. You know, people have always said to me, well, on top of you have a great face for radio, you have a great name for radio, but I can't think of a better name for radio than Chris Watts. Thank you very much.
I know.
And the lady whose smiling face I really look forward to seeing every morning at 4:30 a.m., Angela Dias. Thank you all for being part of the panel. And the panelists will also be available for any questions if you have any afterwards. I also want to remind you that the exhibit is downstairs. Oh, it's right across the hall, the Bob Steele exhibit, which you will not want to miss. I am featured in that, I proudly say. It's right across the hall if you have a few minutes to take a look at that afterwards as well. I thank you all. It's available at many local libraries. I believe there are 18 editions at 18 different libraries, including the Hartford Public Library. Yes, he's talking about the large edition of Bob Steele, the history of Bob Steele.
Century. It's called Bob Steele's Century.
Bob Steele's Century is the name of the
10.
edition. And it's available at 18 local libraries. Hartford Public Library is one of them. And I thank you all. You have been a fabulous audience. Thank you for joining us.
And I would like to add my thanks to everybody else's thanks, and also to thank you for coming out today. This was a wonderful conversation about radio. I loved what Angela said about radio being woven into our lives, because it really is. And I appreciate all of your comments and your help with this program. And I'd also like to remind you, you can watch this program again at ct-n.com. If you go to the on-demand section and look for the Old State House, you can find all of our programs there to watch. And we have other programs coming up next month. We're going to be talking about women in politics. In April, we'll be talking about the history of transportation and transportation issues in Connecticut today. And in June, Governor Lowell Weicker will be joining Diane Smith for a conversation about his life in politics. So we hope that you can come out for those things, and that you will fill out your surveys and provide your email address if you have one, so that we can send you more information about programs if you're interested. Thanks so much, and thanks again to all of you.